The felt-unnaturalness of suffering, aging, dying, death. Why? Bruce Charlton. Perhaps the very root of religion and philosophy is to explain why we regard suffering, aging, dying, and death, and other such facts of mortal life, to be unnatural, unjust, a violation of the natural order. Since these aspects of life are universals, it would be supposed that men would just take them for granted, yet that is not the case. They are instead experienced as a problem. The puzzle is therefore the combination of degeneration and death, with an attitude that they ought not to happen. Traditional religions and philosophies, ancient and modern, have come up with many attempted explanations for this situation. For example, the idea that death etc. are an illusion, in the eternal, divine, changeless scheme of things, or the opposite idea that because they are real and inevitable, therefore we should not be bothered about them, followed by attempts to train people into this attitude of indifference. Materialist modernists ignore the strangeness of our attitude, and instead try to cure problems by technological means, so that there would then be nothing to worry about. For example, attempting to engineer no pain, prevent decline, and enable either a quick and painless death, or entertaining hopes that death itself will be abolished somehow, sooner or later. This is the mainstream secular/left/liberal therapeutic idea of morality as suffering, and virtue as that which diminishes suffering, and, conversely, sin as that which increases suffering. But the serious and honest thinker will recognize that the puzzle is deeper, and none of these are true answers. A genuine explanation needs to explain, and therefore stating variations upon there is nothing to explain, for example it's all meaningless random/determinism, merely kicks the can onto the deeper question of why we should, and so universally, ever have felt there was something to explain. The major modern solution to this most profound of questions is, simply, not to think about it. This is an attempt not to think, by active and powerful distraction, and by destruction of the possibility of thinking, enforced by propaganda and officialdom. And this is, perhaps, the real and deepest reason for that attitude of total rejection of the past, and destruction of all reminders of the past, which has gathered so much strength over the past few decades, and lies behind our addiction to media and other technologies of stimulus saturation/immersion, distraction and intoxication. Yet this problem cannot be avoided. It will always be there, and an implicit, lived by, revealed preference, answer will always be in place, even when that answer is being denied explicitly. Attempting paradoxically to avoid the problem, for example thinking about how not to think, is at the root of much that is most evil in the world, because trying to ignore a real and inescapable problem is itself to affiliate to the powers of evil, the Prince of Lies and his empire of lies. The reason why J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings is experienced by so many people as the most profound of novels, is that, by his own account, it was rooted in his recognition of the centrality of this problem. One of Tolkien's greatest, though least known, works was indeed addressing this problem directly. Tolkien himself never could formulate an answer satisfactory to himself, but he recognized that this failure did not make the problem go away. My feeling is that it is acknowledging the problem, and understanding what is at stake, that is vital, rather than formulating a satisfactory answer. Because then we will be in a position to recognize the true and saving explanation when, after death, Jesus Christ will show us the nature of our perplexed condition, and how it can be solved, eternally. Protection from lies. William Wildblood. I was asking myself recently that if I knew I was going to die in a few days' time, what would I tell my children in an attempt to protect them from what is to come in the future? I mean by that the spiritual ravages that have been ongoing in their present form for several decades but, from being on the periphery, have now moved center stage and are becoming ever more embedded in the culture like a cancer that spreads and eventually take over its host's body. What can protect against this? When almost the whole world is infected with lies, where can we find truth? Human beings are often reluctant to go against prevailing good opinion, but that is what we absolutely must do to have any hope of salvaging our souls from the darkness of the present times. All parents know that, try as they might, however they bring up their children, these are going to be subject to many other influences. This can be a good thing, but in this day and age it rarely is. The culture is decadent. We assume we are more advanced than our ancestors, and in some ways we are, but the fact is that all the signs of the times point to dissolution. Liberalism is taken as a mark of an enlightened society, but historically it always occurs in a dying and degenerate culture that has lost touch with reality, a civilization that has become spoilt and inwardly rotten and is consequently unable to discriminate between right and wrong. The blurring of the boundaries between the sexes, now regarded as progressive but actually a clear indication of separation from nature, and don't forget that when we reject nature we reject God, who is the author of nature, is another phenomenon that occurs regularly when a civilization falls in on itself, having cut itself off from higher reality because of its advancements have deluded it into thinking it is spiritually self-sufficient. It can be tiresome when people like me go on about how bad the world is getting. I'm 67 and older people are always accused of moaning about how things aren't how they used to be. But I don't look back to the time of my youth as a golden age. It certainly was not. On the other hand, the separation from God and nature, though well underway, had not progressed as far as it has now. Most people don't know this because material wealth and technological advancements insulate us from the spiritual poverty in which we live. In the first world we are better off than ever before, with access to all kinds of things our forefathers could not have imagined, but this is very much a two-edged sword because it cuts us off all the more from reality. We live in a collapsing world and yet few people realize it. This is all part of the test humanity is undergoing. The collapse is like a refiner's fire. How do we react when the culture tells us obvious lies? Firstly, we must hold fast to the truth, but we must also avoid the corruption of the world affecting our own hearts by responding to it with anger and hatred. At least, some anger and hatred is not only permissible but actually right, because if you love truth you must hate lies. But these emotions should not be allowed too much sway, or they will overwhelm you and drag you down into the very negativity you are condemning. Therefore, let your love of truth or love of God be the defining tenor of your mind, and everything else spring from that. What I mean is, hatred of evil should never become stronger than love of good and should only be used in the service of that love. What could I tell my children to help protect them in the future? The answer is obvious. Read the Gospels. Get to know Jesus. Familiarize yourself with the truth and wisdom to be found in the New Testament, and you will have all the protection you need. There is more, of course. You have to bring Christ into your own heart and mind, and the true Christ, not some man-made image of him, but this is the foundation of a proper spiritual life. What is the most important thing about Jesus Christ? The possibility of resurrected eternal life, the fourth gospel, or the second coming, Matthew and Luke. Bruce Charlton. 3 years ago I wrote a post about my, to me shocking, realization that the idea of a second coming of Christ was not a part of his teaching, and had, in effect, displaced Jesus' core teaching of the possibility of resurrection for those who followed him. I still feel much the same as I did then, and am still shocked by what I regard as the distortion or even omission of what I believe to be Jesus' overwhelmingly primary teaching concerning eternal life beyond mortal death. I am especially shocked by the unacknowledged implication that Jesus failed to attain his goals the first time round and therefore needs to return and finish the job. And/or that Jesus, despite multiple protestations that he was not a king of this world, had promised to come back and perfect this earthly life. But I also realize that this is of no interest to most Christians, and indeed utterly unconvincing to them, since they read the Bible, or take their understanding of the Christian faith, on the basis of an utterly different set of assumptions, so that this difference of understanding is incommensurable. Nonetheless, I find it deeply reassuring to believe that, in fact, Jesus' core and essential message was very simple, simple enough to be described in a couple of sentences and to be understood by a young child. This simple gift from Jesus seems to be exactly what we most need in the world now, and an offer that would also be most likely to lead to salvation beyond mortal death, even for those who die knowing nothing, or only falsehoods and slanders, about Christ. Many of the bad trends of the modern era are evil twists, then wrong choices, made from developments of consciousness that were intended, by God, for our benefit. Bruce Charlton. One of the malign aspects of the secular socio-political divide between left and right, is that the evils of leftism tend to be opposed both root and branch by the right, whereas the root of the change is often either potentially good, or at least necessary, and it is actually the branch that is evil. I think this applies very generally, across many of the isms that get used to justify the major strategies and policies since the 1700s, abolition of slavery, pacifism, the various socialisms, feminism, anti-racism, etc. What needs to be kept in mind is that it is the motivation behind actions which ultimately counts in terms of values, not actions themselves. It is the intent and spirit which matters primarily in values, not the systematic application of the letter of laws, regulations, principles, etc. If we consider socialism in its various manifestations, there seems little doubt that in the early decades, much of it, although probably not Marx and Engels, was well motivated by people who, mistakenly, overall, believed that the Industrial Revolution had impoverished the poorest classes, as evidenced by the increasing numbers of the poor, especially in cities. This was, objectively, an error of causal attribution, because what was really happening was that the poorest classes had their condition raised such that after the Industrial Revolution the poorest classes survived in increasing numbers but in extreme poverty, instead of, as in earlier centuries, dying of poverty. Furthermore, the extreme poverty was concentrated in cities, where the intellectual class could not help but observe it, rather than being invisibly spread across many, but scattered, cottages and hovels of the countryside. The increasing urban poverty that the socialists were observing was actually a result of increasing, not reducing, standards of living. However, if the socialists' causal inferences had been correct, then the adoption of socialism was not, at the time, unreasonable, and was, often, motivated by genuinely humanitarian impulses. In other words, there was a real problem, increasing urban poverty, but the proposed answers, for example coercive redistribution of wealth by an all-powerful central government in the direction of equality, was based on false understanding, and, when attempted, created other, larger and more long-term destructive problems, including spiritual corruption, that were then ignored or denied. My point is that socialism was a response to a real problem, but was the wrong response to a misunderstanding of the causes of the problem. And furthermore, socialism was operating from a materialist perspective that at first placed the physical as more urgently important than the spiritual, then, because of the nature of this perspective and the effect of habit, soon evolved into denying the reality of the spiritual altogether, and eventually, nowadays, both asserting, and behaving on the basis that, the physical and material world is everything. Looking back from where we now are, i.e. the most evil, because most value-inverted, system in history, it is tempting to assume that socialism was wholly evil, and that therefore the answer would be to roll back history to restore the situation before socialism. But my understanding is that the problems that led to socialism were real, and new, problems. they derived from the Industrial Revolution, and therefore the proper response to Industrial Revolution problems would need to have a true understanding of the deep causes of the Industrial Revolution. In seeking the causes of the Industrial Revolution, we need to consider material causes, the sort of thing that economic historians consider, but Christians also need to consider what God may have been aiming at in enabling the Industrial Revolution to happen. And Christians will want to regard the spiritual causes as, ultimately, deeper and more significant than the material ones. We may agree that the outcomes of the Industrial Revolution have been net evil, yet God does not intend evil, but rather He works by providing us with opportunities. If men, en masse, made wrong and evil choices when confronted by the many new possibilities of the Industrial Revolution, then that was the responsibility of men, but is not proof of God's intent and hopes. I understand God to be working to allow men to develop their consciousness towards a more divine level, i.e. to enable theosis. This can also be understood as involving the increase of freedom/agency. And it can also be understood as God encouraging men, through history and also as individuals, which processes are related, to grow up from the passivity and unconsciousness of spiritual childhood, through spiritual adolescence, to a spiritual maturity where choices are active and consciousness. From this perspective, we could interpret the Industrial Revolution as a consequence of changes in men's consciousness, in men's relationships to the world, including other men. The Industrial Revolution therefore presented men with challenges which, if the right, good, choices had been made, would have led to spiritual learning and greater spiritual maturity. But these opportunities came with the risk that wrong choices would instead be made, these opportunities would be lost, and, because men were more free and had greater individual agency, the outcome could potentially be worse than was possible at early phases of human consciousness. So, the Industrial Revolution was an event that brought with it high potential rewards in terms of man's spiritual agency, but also the possibility that this increased agency would be used to reject the spiritual and result in worse men in a worse world. And it turned out that most men made the wrong choices, and got the worse world. We could see something similar for several of the more specialized aspects of post-industrial revolution society and psychology. For instance, feminism can be understood as rooted in a change of the actuality of the spiritual relationship between men and women, which emerged as part of that modern change of consciousness that led up to the Industrial Revolution. This new relationship between men and women was a new fact, and was the problem which mankind had to face, and face it from the perspective of newly increased free agency. Clearly, from a Christian perspective, feminism as is represents the outcome of wrong choices in face of these problems, and feminism is responsible for great corruption and evil, including official and coerced moral inversions. Nonetheless, there was a real problem to which feminism was the wrong solution, and there was, and still is, to some extent, the possibility of better choices in face of this problem. In conclusion, I believe that Christians need to be able to see more deeply into the problems and issues of our times than a falsely dichotomous choice between either accepting the evil mass majority ideology, or an attempted rollback towards the attitudes, motivations, and behaviors of pre-modern times, and a pre-modern consciousness which no longer exists. The first, modernist assimilation, is straightforwardly evil, although deriving from real problems that might have led to good, if men had made better choices. The other, rollback, is based on a denial of real problems and real changes, and is therefore impossible to accomplish, and will lead, indirectly, to evil if it is attempted. What we need instead to do is recognize that the problems of modern man are not identical with those of ancient men, and this is part of God's plan of creation. Therefore, we should start from where we actually are, and this time use our new powers of agency and free autonomy of consciousness, to make the right choices, from good motivations. What can Christian parents do to protect their children? Francis Berger. I am exploring this question because I occasionally get some indirect criticism concerning my apparent lack of concern about the fate of my child and Christian children in general. The criticism is connected to salvation. The thrust of the criticism is the individual, personal choice for salvation on the part of Christian parents and how this does little to help their children who, it is assumed, will be left to fend for themselves in an increasingly hellish world once the parents depart from mortal life. I suppose I could get into the problems of framing the matter in such a way or approaching the subject from the perspective of anxiety, but I won't. Instead, I will touch upon some basic metaphysical assumptions I hold. When approached superficially, these metaphysical assumptions may provide little comfort to anxious Christian parents concerned about the well-being of their children in a world that grows darker by the day, but I hope that said anxious Christian parents will engage the assumptions I have outlined regardless. The first assumption is that my child is God's child first. That God knows him and loves him as much as I do, and more. God allowed my child to be born into this world in this time and place because he understands that the experience offers my child the opportunity to reap immense spiritual benefits accessed only through the experience of mortal life. He would not have allowed my child to be born into this world in this time and place if the opportunity for such benefits were inaccessible or impossible. Because God loves my child, he has faith that my child possesses, or can access, what is needed to make the choice for salvation and will work actively to guide my child toward this choice. The second assumption centers on my understanding that mortal life in this world is inevitably and unavoidably entropic. Entropy continuously chips away at the temporary order we sometimes experience. Every person who embarks on the journey of mortal life dies. Some die young, some tragically, and some violently. Others live long, extended lives filled with vitality and vigor, but even they ultimately succumb to the forces of sickness, age, and decay. Thus, the material aliveness of individual beings in this world is temporary. Nothing material in this world lasts forever. Barring sudden accidents or illnesses, we will grow old, wither, and die like our great-grandparents, grandparents, and parents. Our children, my child, will do the same. However, the entropic state of the world also allows for the possibility of creativity. Our worldly creations are not free from entropy, but the creative acts themselves live on eternally. The third assumption accepts the reality of suffering in this mortal life. The continuous onslaught of disorder on temporary order ensures varying degrees of suffering, primarily physical. Yet physical suffering also induces psychological and spiritual suffering. A big part of our experience in this mortal life involves dealing with suffering, including my child's suffering. The fourth assumption concerns Jesus' gift of salvation and eternal life. Although we inhabit an entropic world of unavoidable suffering and death, we can choose to overcome this world by believing on Jesus and following him into everlasting life. This gift of salvation and eternal life is also available to my child who, like us, is an eternal spiritual being. I, as a parent, must accept that my child existed before he came into this world as my son. Moreover, my child's experience in this entropic world of suffering and death is the only knowable means through which he can accept Jesus' gift of salvation and eternal life. Without this experience, my son would likely not have the opportunity to follow Jesus into heaven. The fifth assumption, a fact rather than an assumption, stems from the understanding that the choice for salvation and heaven is deeply individual and personal. As a Christian parent, I may succeed in providing my child with the best possible material and spiritual conditions in this entropic world. I may even succeed in protecting him from much of the evil infesting the world. However, in the end, nothing I do as a parent protects him completely, nor should it, or guarantees his salvation, for the simple reason that his salvation is entirely up to him, in the same way that my salvation is entirely up to me. I can guide, nurture, and assist my son toward choosing salvation and heaven, but I cannot decide for him. I cannot ensure his salvation. Nor can I force him into salvation and heaven. I must accept that my child may, despite my best intentions and actions, reject Jesus' offer. I could go on, but I think the above suffice to paint a fairly clear picture of my basic assumptions concerning protecting children and ensuring their salvation. These assumptions do not entail that there is a set formula for raising children in this world and protecting them from evil, but they do provide a basis, at least for me. Having said that, all parents must do their best within the conditions of their own individual circumstances. So, with all that in mind, what have I done to protect my child and guide him towards salvation? In terms of externals, my wife and I took the opportunity to move away from the Anglo world and settle in a rural part of Hungary. We hoped the move would shield my son from some of the blatant evil that permeates the Anglo-West, particularly in education. However, Hungary is very far from immune from the evils that plague the West proper. Nonetheless, we believe the move has managed to spare our son from some of the most obvious harm. It helps that nearly all of the families in the village we live in are cohesive and Christian-oriented. Divorces and dysfunctional families are the exceptions rather than the rule. Living in a small community of 600 has also allowed my son to nurture relationships he may not have nurtured in larger, urban settings. The pastoral surroundings have also imbued him with a closer connection to nature, but the entropic nature of the world is still there, chipping away. Being able to purchase a home debt-free has alleviated some of the financial stresses and struggles that sometimes taint family life. Attending the small Roman Catholic church in the village and the Roman Catholic school in a nearby town provides my son with a sense of community and some of the externals of Christianity, which I believe are helpful for children. Thankfully, the Catholic faith here has not been completely poisoned by leftism, but it is still very much aligned with the system. 3 years ago, my son made the personal choice to serve as an altar boy and continues to do so to this day. Though I hope my son eventually becomes a romantic Christian, I know that romantic Christianity is an adult choice. For now, it is enough for him to understand basic Christian beliefs about salvation and heaven as a child. When it comes to Christian teaching at home, my wife and I have chosen to employ a light touch. Though I sometimes speak about general Christian matters, my wife and I have intuitively decided upon a show rather than tell approach. When my son is older, I hope to be able to discuss Christianity with him in a more direct manner. In terms of media, my wife and I make efforts to shield our son from noxious material, particularly online, but we do not expressly forbid him from exploring secular media, for the simple reason that we know such prohibition would likely only increase curiosity and generate rebellion. These external choices have served us well thus far, but they have their obvious limits. There really is no place you can go to protect your child. Some places may be better than others, but no place is safe. Furthermore, there's only so much you can do to protect your child, and being overprotective probably does more harm than good. For example, our current location puts us fairly close to the raging proxy war in the east and another potential conflict simmering just to the south. As far as countries go, Hungary is still firmly within the EU and the system. It has a tragic history, mostly because of its location, and that inherent historical tragedy is still unfolding today. Many Hungarians are no better than their atheistic, leftist counterparts in the West. The culture is predominantly secular and materialistic. Furthermore, even if I could provide my son with the ideal place to grow up, that ideal place will change, or he may decide to move away to a less ideal place one day. The current economic environment ensures that whatever financial freedom we have enjoyed as a family is steadily being encroached upon and eroded away via inflation and various global crises. Attending church and a religious school offers no protection against anything, including rejecting God. On the contrary, such experiences often breed passivity or system conformity or, sometimes, fortify the choice against God and creation. Modeling and infusing Christian living at home likewise guarantees nothing. Avoiding or criticizing leftist media and culture also offers no safeguard against the media and culture. And none of what I have outlined above addresses unforeseen challenges, misfortunes, and tragedies in the form of accidents, illnesses, war, economic collapse, or what have you. When all is said and done, I view family life in this world as an ideal. It is an ideal that I must approach with the right motivations and into which I invest a great deal of effort. Naturally, I wish to protect my son from evil and guide him towards salvation. However, despite my best intentions and motivations, I know I cannot fully protect my son, nor can I ensure his salvation. I can do my best to make the world a positive, nurturing, loving place, but I have to accept that the world often works in the opposite direction. I also have to accept that this is the best that can be done. Also, I can do my best to make my son aware of Jesus' offer and encourage him to accept it, but I cannot, as a parent, make that choice for him. Neither can Christ. The choice is his. Such is the nature of freedom. Such is the nature of his personal agency and power. All I can do after I have honestly done my best is have faith that my son will align with truth on his own. Faith that I will be able to help my son should I depart this world before him. Faith that my time with my son will not be restricted to our time together in this world. There are 1,000 more things I could say or should say, but I'll leave it there for now. Why is the Superman considered necessary? From Nietzsche to shorter transhumanism. Bruce Charlton. As a late teen, I was deeply influenced by the work of Berger, and followed the trajectory of the man himself by beginning as someone who sought nothing more than gradual improvement in living conditions, by means, I assumed, of Fabian socialism, to a recognition that, even if wholly successful, this would leave the fundamental problems, the fundamental unsatisfactoriness, of life unaddressed. In other words, no amount of tinkering with the system could overcome the inadequacy of men. And indeed, how that the system ever really be improved when men, even the best of men, were so profoundly and ineradicably flawed? In other words, a better world is not enough. Our heart's desire is for a qualitatively different and greater mode of living. As a typical leftist radical, Shaw's thinking was built upon the rejection of Christianity, what I have called the attitude of anything but Christianity. This attitude, which I shared for most of my life, is prepared to search the world, and consider almost any metaphysics, ideology or philosophy, except Christianity. Such radicalism, which is nowadays mainstream, normal, almost universal in the West, is thus rooted in a negative and oppositional motivation, which is what makes radicalism able to tolerate almost infinite incoherence, and which makes it always tend towards destruction, as we may see all around us. Sure, therefore, sought the greater life in the context of this mortal world. The idea behind the play Man and Superman is loosely derived from Nietzsche, who invented and popularized the concept of the Superman as a qualitatively superior man, and the best/only hope for the future. In other words, Shaw assumes that there is only this world, and that Jesus Christ's promises of resurrection and heaven are untrue, therefore our only grounds for hope, or only honest way of staving off despair, lies in improving this world. Shaw recognizes that this world cannot be sufficiently improved because of men are just not good enough to make or inhabit the kind of world that would justify life. On the contrary, since men are the limiting factor, it is men that must positively be transformed. Hence the Superman, he is what man must become if life is to be worthwhile. This is why the Superman is considered as necessary. Indeed, if the Superman does arise, then he will be that which transforms society for the better, because men as they are cannot really know what changes to make, nor are current men properly motivated actually to make good societal changes. An attempt to make a better society without the Superman will therefore be undermined by corruption of comprehension, motivation and conduct, and reform will merely become what it always, covertly, was, a mask for new forms of exploitation. So, it seems to be the case that the Superman must come first. So the Superman seems to be necessary, but what exactly the Superman might be, and how he might arise, has always been contested among those who propose the idea. Shaw was apparently never able to make up his mind. Sometimes he thought that the Superman might be evolved, from the right kind of breeding, as with the above excerpt from Man and Superman. In that play, and its supplementary preface and appendices, the idea occurs that if the best women and the best men are able to reproduce, then the right combinations may lead to the Superman, either gradually or in a single vast evolutionary leap. Shaw's socialism is put forward as a means to this end. By eliminating all barriers of class, wealth, education etc., Shaw envisages that the best men and women can find each other, and that they will have the best children, and they will not be troubled by the raising of these children because that also will be done by a socialist society. In other words, at least when this mood was upon him, Shaw apparently regards the Superman as a quasi-genetic problem, and the solution as a matter of selective breeding. And yet, when he states this materialist perspective, he tends swiftly to contradict it as both inadequate and wrong-headed, because Shaw had a strong and almost spiritual aspiration, and also a pessimistic understanding of man's limits and possibilities. This came through in Back to Methuselah, in which higher forms of human consciousness emerge due to creative evolution, which is envisaged in deistic terms, as a property of reality. The idea is that it is part of the nature of things that the universe strives first for life, then for consciousness, and then self-consciousness. Part of this is that lifespan is extended, until it becomes immortality at the point when bodies are discarded and X-men become pure spirits of consciousness. This is another vision of the Superman. And this is driven by the life force, which is mentioned several times in Man and Superman in implicit contradiction to the selective breeding idea, as if Shaw cannot decide between them, or wants to cover all bases. Whereas selective breeding is conceived by men, and organized, made possible, by strategy, the life force uses men in its blind gropings and experiments to attain the Superman, which is the abolition, or transcendence, of man. It uses men impersonally, and when each experiment is finished, casts them aside onto the scrap heap, implied to be annihilation of the self, along with the body. This is the true joy in life, the being used for a purpose recognized by yourself as a mighty one, the being thoroughly worn out before you are thrown on the scrap heap, the being a force of nature instead of a feverish selfish little clod of ailments and grievances complaining that the world will not devote itself to making you happy. From the preface to Man and Superman, Shaw speaking as himself. The morality that Shaw proposes is one in which men willingly serve the life force, and willingly sacrifice themselves in the quest for the Superman. What has happened to the Superman in the 21st century? Has he disappeared from culture? No. Instead he has been downgraded into transhumanism. Instead of a qualitatively superior man, perhaps a man of higher and more spiritual consciousness, one who will discern and lead us to a better society, transhumanism has reduced the Superman's capabilities to the level of emotions. Transhumanism starts with the feverish selfish little clod of ailments and grievances, and takes seriously his complaints that the world will not devote itself to making him happy, and transhumanism envisages exactly a world that is genuinely devoted to making the selfish little clod perfectly happy. Transhumanism envisages a world without suffering, and consisting entirely of varieties of gratification, and this is to be attained by material means such as drug usage and other therapies, and genetic engineering, which replaces Shaw's hope for selective breeding. Transhumanism dispenses with all residues of the spiritual, all deistic concepts of a universe tending towards higher consciousness, and instead aims at an eternal life attained by the abolition of sickness and aging, aiming at the defeat of entropy by correcting random error and outpacing degeneration with repair. The Superman of transhumanism is at the opposite pole from Nietzsche's hero of action and self-expression, or from Shaw's man of higher morality who embraces his own destruction in pursuit of abstract perfection of contemplation. Instead there is envisaged a passive consumer of emotions, implicitly being protected and sustained by an uncorrupt and well-motivated, all-powerful ruling elite. What matters to transhumanism is how the world seems, not how the world is. Well, such are the terminal destinations of reflection on the human condition, when anything but Christianity is the baseline assumption. The pity of it is that great creative intelligences such as Nietzsche and Shaw did not turn their abilities and motivations onto Christianity itself. Such thinkers deployed a double standard against Christianity. About anything except Christianity they would expend great effort, over long periods, to wrestle with concepts and ideologies in pursuit of the good life. They would think and debate endlessly over what socialism really was, what was its essence, and what it ought to be, but the reality of Christianity was accepted second-hand, as a prepackaged parcel, with barely a second thought. When it came to Christianity, Shaw and many others simply accepted that the proper and necessary definition and conceptualization was pretty much whatever stories they were told in their childhood, or whatever the worst of pseudo-Christian hypocrites did rather than said. So whereas other ideas were understood in terms of their potential, or ideal attributes, Christianity was judged by the worst of its worldly corruptions. Whereas everything except Christianity was approached as a core creative project, Christianity was regarded as something fixed and already defined. This tendency was reinforced by the fact that defenders of Christianity, such as Shaw's great friend G.K. Chesterton, regarded Christianity in the same way, that is, they understood Christianity as something eternally unchangeable in its nature. Something beyond human creativity. Something, moreover, about which the creative genius had to defer to history, tradition and, above all, the church, whichever church that might be, for present purposes. The genius grappling with Christianity could therefore go so far, and no further. Only in Christianity was the genius trammelled. Thus Christianity was, and remained, what it was and untouchable, and creative geniuses should look elsewhere when they strove to understand and redescribe reality. This meant that very few of the great geniuses of ideas in modern times were Christians. There was no scope for them in Christianity. They were confronted with a take-it-or-leave-it attitude about church Christianity, one that implied men of the past had got it right in all essentials, and any dissent was necessarily error and not Christianity. Yet genius is predicated on the assumption that achievement is not constrained by what is, and that no matter what the quality and eminence of past men was or may have been, there is always the possibility of creative breakthrough for one whose motivations are true. And to the extent that these motivations are true. If Nietzsche, Shaw, and the modern transhumanists would have expended a tithe of their efforts on grappling fundamentally with Christianity, in understanding what it is experientially, each for himself and from himself, in the deepest and most sustained way of which they are capable, well, the history of the world would have been very different, and probably much better. Post-mortal, pre-resurrected, spirit life is analogous to dreaming sleep. Bruce Charlton. After mortal life we die and become spirit beings, and it is these post-mortal spirits who may choose to become resurrected. What is life like as a post-mortal spirit? What will you and I be like at the time when we are confronted by the chance and choice of resurrected eternal life? The condition of post-mortal souls seems to have been accessible and known in ancient times, and in the years before Christ, the ancient Greeks left us with descriptions of Hades, while the ancient Hebrews described much the same condition as Sheol. The condition of such spirit life can be described in terms of a state of dementia or delirium, but is perhaps most easily comprehended in terms of dreaming sleep. During dreaming sleep, our spirit is cut off from the body, and from the environment. That is, in general, we lose sensations of what is going on inside us, and in the world around us. Our spiritual self mostly breaks free from the body, but in sleep the spirit does not wholly break free, because the spirit must return to the body on awakening, and therefore there must remain a connection, and this residual connection of spirit with body can be greater or lesser. When the connection is greater, then the body and/or the environment around the sleeping body can influence the dreaming spirit, and we find some degree in which the physical shapes our dreams. For instance, a stomach pain or a ticking clock may be taken up in the dream, and, in part or in whole, become part of the dream. But sometimes the connection between spirit and body is diminished to the merest thread, and to the extent that the spirit does break free, we are then in a similar state to post-mortal spirit life. What are the characteristic experiences of this kind of dreaming sleep, in a qualitative and formal sense? In dreaming we retain our sense of self, of being an individual with a personal perspective, and we remain who we are, but the quality of experience changes. The typical mood of dreaming is one of perplexity, a sense of insecure grasp of the situation, of our understanding continually slipping away. We forget important things in the dream, and then later in the dream they are recalled with a sense of puzzlement. How could I have forgotten that? Or else we may discover major things of great importance in the dream that, somehow, in real life, we had never noticed before. In the dream we may take for granted bizarre situations that we, somehow, find ourselves in, or conversely, may find ourselves unable to comprehend and function in situations that we would normally find routine. Recognition of people and situations is unmoored, much as the spirit is unmoored from the body. For example, we may recognize someone familiar who then turns out really to be someone else, or else it turns out that a stranger in the dream is really someone familiar, although they may look and behave completely differently. These dream experiences are very similar to delusional misidentifications observed in psychoses. These kinds of dreaming experiences derive, I believe, from the greatly diminished connection between the spirit and the body during dreaming sleep. If we can imagine this disconnection becoming total and potentially permanent, then we may have some idea of what it may be like to be dead, but not resurrected. And it may be from such a dream-like state, or perhaps more exactly from a temporarily lucid dream state, made possible by divine intervention, that we make the choice about resurrection. That is, a state when the dream situation becomes suffused by an increased self-consciousness and ability to choose, when, perhaps, the dream self becomes more detached from dream experience, and knows it as a dream, in other words, knows the reality of the situation. Then, it may be, we are confronted by the decision of whether to follow Jesus Christ through the process of transformation that is resurrection, to render us eternally incarnated, and to continue into heaven. Perhaps this transformation can itself be imagined, as if from a dream, as our spirits meeting with Jesus Christ and knowing Him to be Jesus Christ, standing as the Good Shepherd in front of a portal, a doorway, the entrance into the sheepfold that is heaven. We are granted the comprehension that we may choose to follow Jesus through that doorway, and the knowledge that if we do so, as we are solidifying, condensing, into eternal bodies, we will be taking with us only that which good, only that which is love, love of God, of fellow men, of divine creation. Also, if we choose to pass through that doorway, all that is of sin, death, corruption, will be left behind. What I would emphasize here is that when we make that decision, it will be from an experienced situation that is somewhat like a dream, and the decision will be made by selves that are somewhat like our dream selves. But a dream-like state that we know to be reality, and the choice will be made by what we then know to be our real, eternal and divine self. 10 days into this new year, the year of civilizational collapse. Bruce Charlton. It has become a dreaded annual tradition for me to say something snarky about the so-called New Year. This past one has been dominated by the Fire Nation War, the start of World War III. The escalation has been all but one-sided, with the Western powers making some of the most outrageous and gratuitous provocations imaginable, and the Fire Nation, in particular their leader, demonstrating astonishing restraint while building vital alliances that prevent the FN's isolation when, not if, the pressure for escalation becomes irresistible. This coming year will be, I predict, the year of civilizational collapse in the West, and by collapse I mean an irreversible and accelerating process of breakdown towards chaos. Yet, of course, such collapse will be deniable, and indeed denied, probably by a majority of the population. One mode of denial will surely be to reconceptualize and explain away civilizational collapse as the consequence of war, hence alleged, unprovoked, foreign aggression. But other pretend rationales will potentially be wheeled out, such as climate emergency/breakdown, Birdemic 2.0, epidemics of died suddenly syndrome, explosions of pseudo-racism, or any other selection of engineered, and faked, crises. This will, probably, of course I don't really know, happen because it is ever more obvious that the sorothic powers of spiteful destructive evil are ever more dominant in the West, and are not being recognized as such, but instead ignored and excused by nearly everybody. Of course there is also colossal destruction from short-termist profiteering on an unprecedented scale, which is amplified by deliberately constructed incompetence of leadership personnel, which has become so extreme, and so endemic, that people have ceased to notice that there we are well into the consequences of an active process of selection of known incompetent, thoroughly corrupted leaders in, I think, all Western nations. So, those who are ultimately holding greatest power in the West and who knowingly want evil destruction, are less and less trammeled by the presence of anyone who might desire to oppose them, or be able to oppose them. Collapse is just a question of time, and, since the underlying situation is deteriorating, the longer delayed, the more rapid and extreme it will be. While this is, of course, a bit of a worry, it ought not be a cause of fear, not if we reflect that fear is a sin, and that the mandatory Christian virtues include faith, trust in God, and hope, assurance of ultimate good. Yet we must recall that faith and hope are directed at the spirit and eternity, hence mostly post-mortal resurrected life. The absolute assurances of faith and hope ought not to be directed at the material circumstances of this finite mortal life. Luckily for Christians, we are not dependent on the general, civilizational circumstances of this earthly existence. But we do have a job to do, and that is to understand, discern, and choose. That is, to know good from evil, to locate and to take the side of good. This need not be a problem, unless we insist upon being directed by external, this worldly, merely human influences. So long as we are prepared to take responsibility for our own salvation and theosis, to work things out for ourselves, there will no shortage of help, guidance and comfort from divine sources and by means of the active work of God's creation in the world and ourselves. Resolution? How about working on consciousness? Francis Berger. After we've resolved to quit smoking, eat fewer carbs, be nicer to our mother-in-laws, and lose that extra 10 pounds that's been making us feel blue all year. We may want to consider working on consciousness, not as some kind of flimsy resolution aiming for superficial self-improvement, but as an active choice for God and creation. Teenagers can physically become adults but still remain teenagers in their hearts and minds when it comes to how they think about, understand, and relate to themselves, other beings, the world, and God. Thus, becoming an adult is not merely about maturing physically. An active choice for adulthood must also be made. It must come from within rather than from out with. The same applies to consciousness and spirituality. How we think about, understand, and relate to ourselves, other beings, the world, and God should emanate from within rather than from out with. Testing our current state of consciousness is as easy, actually, quite difficult, as stripping away everything external from how we think about, understand, and relate to God. Try it. What are you left with once you remove tradition, churches, doctrines, customs, and all the rest of it? Start from wherever you end up, and then continue working inward rather than outward after that. Begin working externally once you know you have reached a solid point from which to proceed internally. Why bother? Because mature religious consciousness doesn't just happen, it must be chosen. The real work begins after the choice, and the work is not easy, but it is the only way to overcome the alienation, objectification, and externalization that plagues the world. Note, working on consciousness should not be construed as self-improvement or becoming a better person. It is more a matter of discovering the self and becoming a person. Some thoughts to start the process from B'dayef slavery and freedom. The theological doctrine that God created man for his own glory and praise is degrading to man, and degrading to God also. God as personality does not desire a man over whom he can rule, and who ought to praise him, but man as personality who answers his call and with whom communion of love is possible. Consciousness which exteriorizes and alienates is always slavish consciousness. God the master, man the slave, the church the master, man the slave, the family the master, man the slave, nature the master, man the slave, object the master, man subject the slave. The source of slavery is always objectification, that is to say exteriorization, alienation. Man can be a slave to public opinion, a slave to custom, to morals, to judgments and opinions which are imposed by society. It is difficult to overestimate the violence which is perpetrated by the press in our time. The average man of our day holds the opinions and forms the judgments of the newspaper which he reads every morning. It exercises psychological compulsion upon him. And in view of the falsehood and venality of the press, the effects are very terrible as seen in the enslavement of man and his deprivation of freedom of conscience and judgment. The scope and power of the thinking self. Bruce Charlton. Sometimes, when I am thinking well, I am aware of the tremendous, limitless scope and power of real thinking. This is, I think, a very basic and fundamental human experience and assumption. It is what almost everything is rooted in. Yet it is not sufficient, and it is countered and modified by an awareness of our own inconstancy and failures, the fact that most of the time our thinking is shallow, manipulated, constrained, and utterly unsatisfying. Analogously, we begin life immersed in an unconscious, taken for granted, sense of being in the world, and bound up with the other people in the world, especially our family. We experience ourselves more as concentrations of awareness in a general awareness. Minds are experienced as permeable. Yet, soon we become aware of an opposite sense of being isolated selves, cut off from the world of nature and of other men. We become afraid of others, and of the world, afraid of dying and the death of those we love. We begin to experience a crumbling of meaning, a sense of incoherence, a general tendency towards disintegration and dying. In one sense, at one level, we feel self-sufficient, capable of knowing and creating from ourselves all that we need, yet, at another level we realize that this would actually be a life of ineradicable boredom, and self-inflicted suffering. This is the problem, and, to some extent, most people seek for, or at least hope for, a solution that eradicates the bad aspects and negations of our condition, while making permanent and building from that scope and power, that connection and awareness. There have been many attempts to solve this problem, but almost all are only partially successful. Even in theory, they solve some, but neglect other aspects, and are reducing to saying that the unsolved aspects do not really need to be solved, or that our strengths are actually our problems. Only Christianity solves the whole problem, only Christianity has the potential. And only some, minority, selective Christianities, from those many throughout history. There is only one answer, which is why Jesus Christ is essential. Fortunately for us, but not by luck, but from the deliberate design of God, we are not required to solve the problem for ourselves, but only to recognize and choose the answer, when it is presented to us. Ancient Civilizations. William Wildblood. At one time it was thought that the world was created in 4004 BC. This was following a literal reading of the early books of the Old Testament by a 17th century Irish archbishop called James Ussher, though he was not alone in giving such a recent date. Johannes Kepler and Isaac Newton apparently also thought in similar terms. This seems absurd to us nowadays, as scientific investigation has shown the world to be much earlier in its origin, but I have to say that in my mind 6,000 years is nothing, and I can't imagine how anyone ever thought like that. They didn't in India, where the age of the earth has long been envisaged in millions of years, with days and nights of Brahma, periods of cosmic manifestation and dissolution, alternating ceaselessly. This is a much more realistic scenario. Modern science estimates the world to be about 4.5 billion years old, with life in the form of microscopic organisms first appearing about 3.7 billion years ago. Early types of humans entered the scene around 2 million years ago, with Homo sapiens originating about 300,000 years ago. This is the current official timeline, but is always subject to change as new discoveries are made and old ones reassessed. The first civilizations are thought to have emerged a mere 5,500 years ago in Mesopotamia, following the development of agriculture. I believe that last date will one day seem as ridiculous as we now think of Archbishop Ussher's date for the creation of the world. Granted, a slow development may reach a tipping point at which it suddenly accelerates, but still the length of one time frame, that for the development of man, compared to the rapidity of the other, development of culture, should at the very least raise questions. Is modern civilization really the first there has been on the earth, given the vast periods involved? Or are there other possibilities concerning the life of human beings on this planet? The author Graham Hancock has a recent series on Netflix in which he explores the idea that a great civilization was destroyed at the end of the last ice age, when fragments of a comet from the torrid meteor shower hit the Earth, causing massive floods that swept away all traces of that culture. It is thought to have been a seafaring, therefore coastal, civilization, and as sea levels are supposed to have risen nearly 200 feet since the time of the presumed impact 12,800 years ago, this fact would explain the absence of any remains that could bear witness to its presence. Nevertheless, myths and tradition from all over the world speak of a global devastation by flood and the destruction of an advanced civilization. Plato's story of Atlantis is known by everyone, and, curiously enough, the date he gives coincides with the date of the presumed comet strike and the rising of sea levels. Hancock is actually only one of many people who have speculated on this subject, but he has done his research and presents a good case for the open-minded, which, unfortunately, is not the scientific community. Occult tradition knows all about ancient civilizations, and it speaks of not just one but several. because these originate at different times in the Earth's evolution when consciousness is not the same as it is today, and even the material environment is different. They are not all the same type as ours. Atlantis, or the civilization that we call Atlantis today, had technology, but it was a very different sort to ours, some of it being indistinguishable to what we would think of as magic. In some ways their capabilities would be greater than ours, in others less. What seems to be the pattern though with all these civilizations is that they rise and fall, progressing to an advanced level of sophistication and then succumbing to hubris, though it may be that even their genetic quality deteriorates too, as ours is said to be doing since the Industrial Revolution, which was a two-edged sword in that it allowed for the survival of individuals with maladaptive mutations who then go on to have children themselves. This is an emotional subject, but if one looks at it logically and without judgment, the facts and the consequences of those facts are clear. Abundance, a comfortable, safe and secure life, will allow for the survival and prospering of individuals who would have previously died because they were not sufficiently fit for the environment. The basic human stock will slowly deteriorate. No one can do anything about this unless one resorts to unacceptable, rightly unacceptable, actions, but it helps explain why advanced societies tend to self-destruct. In a way their achievements work against them. But there is also the fact that as human beings carve out a comfortable world for themselves with wealth and power and a surfeit of pleasure to be had, they lose connections to the gods, the spiritual realm, and this leads to their downfall. All the traditions speak of the flood having come about because of human arrogance and wickedness. The inevitable comparisons with the world today and the state of our civilization, materially and technologically advanced but spiritually impoverished, must be made. Indeed, it may be that we are rediscovering this idea of destroyed ancient civilizations now as a warning. Hancock draws attention to the stories of many societies from all around the world relating how their cultures were started off by mysterious visitors, usually from beyond the seas, who gave primitive peoples the foundation stones of civilization, agriculture, arts and crafts, architectural skills, astronomy and so on. These were often regarded as gods, but it may be that they were survivors from the destroyed civilizations trying to sow seeds for a rebirth. At that time it is probable that primitive hunter-gatherers coexisted with the advanced civilization, for there is no reason other than ideological prejudice to assume that all human groups progressed at an equal pace or were equally developed. The civilized society may have been more vulnerable to environmental catastrophe as, apart from existing in areas now submerged, they would have been less familiar with a hand-to-mouth existence than the hunter-gatherers, who could have adapted much more readily to the new circumstances. Given the long time Homo sapiens has been around, even by current estimation, it may, of course, be even longer than presently recognized. It seems very reasonable to think there have been previous civilizations that have vanished, witness to their presence being obscured by earth changes. And, in fact, that is just what myth and legend tell us. The present cycle is just that, a cycle in the ongoing evolution of the earth, and each cycle starts afresh, though with some input from the past, as the survivors of the putative Atlantis are said to have kick-started civilizations in Egypt, South and Central America and even, I would maintain, Great Britain. We have forgotten so much about our past and who we are. We have forgotten our earthly history, and we have also forgotten our spiritual history. The fact that many different sources are currently trying to remind us of both of these indicates to me that there is a concerted effort to get us to wake up. Obscuring the past may once have had a purpose, as it enabled us to get on with building a new present, but that time is over, and it is now time for humanity to rediscover its earthly and spiritual heritage. This is all the more urgent as there are several signs that what happened before with Atlantis may happen again to us. We are a civilization that has forgotten the gods and lost its sense of reality. It is widely accepted, though publicly ignored, that we are facing economic and cultural collapse, but it may be that other factors may also play their part in determining the future, as they did at the end of the last ice age.